Allies reached new levels today after Democratic Congresswoman Rasheda Talib announced this morning she will not travel to the West Bank. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu initially blocked her and her colleague, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, from entering the country, but the Israeli government changed its mind and gave Congresswoman Talib permission to visit her 90-year-old grandmother on humanitarian grounds. But in a statement released this morning, she wrote in part, quote, "Visiting my grandmother under these oppressive conditions meant to humiliate me would break my grandmother's heart. It would kill a piece of me that always stands up against racism and injustice." Israel's Interior Ministry has since fired back on Twitter with a personal jab. Apparently, her hate for Israel overcomes her love for her grandmother. Congresswoman Omar weighed in late this afternoon in a lengthy thread about her itinerary for the canceled trip. She tweeted, "Denying visits to duly elected members of Congress is not consistent with being either an ally or a democracy. We should be leveraging that aid to stop the settlement and ensure the full rights for Palestinians." Joining me now is Avner Gavriyahu, who is scheduled to be Congresswoman Omar and Talib's tour guide. He serves as the executive director of Breaking the Silence, which is an Israeli veterans organization that aims to raise awareness about communities in the West Bank that live under military occupation. Avner, thank you for joining us. I think the world is curious to understand what you were going to show these two congresswomen in their plan to come and visit Israel and the West Bank.
Yeah, so it's great to be on the show, and we've been around for 15 years. We're a group of Israeli vets. I served as a paratrooper in the West Bank, and our group actually started in the city of Hebron. A bunch of soldiers who served there back in the years of 2000, the Second Intifada, and through their experiences, they came out and decided to share what actually it means to maintain a military control over another people. And we've been conducting tours in the city, and that was exactly what we wanted to show the congresswomen there. I mean, Hebron is the largest, or one of the largest Palestinian cities in the West Bank, and the only city where in the heart of it you'll find a settlement of 750 Israelis guarded by more or less 650 Israeli soldiers. And because of that reality, since the mid-90s, after a massacre that was committed by a settler from an adjacent settlement where 29 Palestinians were murdered, the city is going through a destruction process. And basically, the city center of Hebron has turned into what I think no one can describe other than a ghost town. And we were expecting to show the congresswomen this reality on the ground and share with them our experiences and actually explain to them, I think, the complexity of this reality that we're trying to highlight, because this reality in Hebron is something no one knows enough about, and we believe are positioned well to actually shed a light on that.
So here's the situation. You were a former military member. Many of the group Breaking the Silence, your group, humanitarian organization, a political organization, were members of the Israeli Defense Forces. There are organizations in Israel made up primarily of Jews, Israeli citizens, who are critical of the occupation or some of the effects of the occupation, none of which makes any of you anti-Semites.
No, obviously, it's sometimes absurd to follow the Twitter fights that are going on in the other side of the pond. I mean, I believe, as an Israeli that sees himself as an Israeli patriot, I mean, I love my country. I do what I do for the sake of my country. I just think that it doesn't make sense in 2019 to maintain a military control over millions of people by force. And I think that in that sense, the Israeli military occupation is a Jewish problem, is a problem that me as a Jew, I have to deal with, and I have to think about day in and day out how I can fix. And I think that part of the reason that we agreed to meet the congresswomen was to come and say, look, obviously millions of Palestinians are suffering under military control, but this is something that I have a responsibility for. It's not only something Palestinians have to fight against, but Israeli Jews and Jews around the world. And there are Israelis here that are doing that together with Palestinians on the ground. And obviously, I would say it's the opposite from anti-Semitism, which is a real threat, but it has nothing to do with the work that obviously we do or any anti-occupation activist around the world is doing.
So what does success look like if somebody comes on a visit and you show them Hebron or other things that you're going to show them, and they learn from you and they leave? What would success look like? What would they be thinking? I assume they're not going to be leaving hating Israel. They're going to be leaving understanding some of the complexity that you've tried to describe here in a couple of minutes of what that occupation looks like on the ground for Jews, for Israelis, for Muslims, for Arab Christians, for everybody.
Yeah, totally. I mean, alongside meeting us, they were supposed to meet with some of the Palestinian activists in the city, some amazing activists that have been working together with us on various issues and meeting some of our groups. And I think that that's part of the reality that's important to get away from the city of Hebron. Many people talking about the reality on the ground, talking about the occupation, are sort of shying away from diving into the nitty-gritty. And I think when you go to a place like Hebron, when you walk on the main street of the city, what used to be the main market area, and you walk through a street that Israeli soldiers called a sterile road, and it's sterile from Palestinians. There are places where Palestinians literally cannot leave the front door of their house. And some of our Palestinian friends remember that market running through the streets and in through stores, and today is basically a closed market. And I think taking away from that city, with the complexity of the reality, with the different political players, is that there is something that is simple, and that is that maintaining military force over a civilian population is something that has to end yesterday, has to end 53 years ago. And I think that taking that away isn't so complicated once you go to the ground, once you're on the field. And I think that that's part of what made the Netanyahu government, Netanyahu himself, so scared in allowing them in, to really see this reality, which is straightforward, compelling, and fundamentally wrong.
I want to ask you something, because there has been an alarming rise in anti-Semitism around the world, including here in America. There is also a consciousness growing around the world and in America of the things you are describing, about the things that Israel does in its occupied territories that are not fair and not right. How do you manage to tell people that they can be critical of the activities of the government of Israel in a way that does not involve anti-Semitism, and in fact they can condemn anti-Semitism in the same moment that you can say what Israel is doing in the occupied territories is wrong?
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that there's a few viewers back home that are critical of the current American administration's policies, and they will speak out against it. They will mobilize, organize, write op-eds, go on the press, and try to push their agenda. That's part of the democracy. They're not anti-American. They're not anti-Christian or not anti-American Muslim or anti-Jewish if they criticize specific policies, right? Racism, hatred has nothing to do with real critical questioning. I think that as a Jew and as someone that my family's history is rooted in anti-Semitism, sadly, I will be the first one on the lines coming and fighting anti-Semitism, and I would expect that from any person around the world, not only someone who is Jewish. And sadly, there are hatred thoughts and racist ideologies in different political sections around this issue. But I think that there are things that you can look at and talk about right and wrong. I believe that Israel has a right to exist. Israel is my home. And I hope that it will continue to be my home. I just don't buy into the equation that the existence of the State of Israel means continual and perpetual occupation over millions of people. I would actually separate those two. And I would say our existence and our thriving actually is tied into ending this military control. And pushing that has nothing to do, obviously not with anti-Semitism, but I would even argue definitely has nothing to do with anti-Israelism. I think that agenda is the most pro-Israel agenda you could put on the table today, 180 degrees from the agenda that sadly my government and ministers are promoting.
Avner, thank you for joining me. Avner Gavaryahu is the executive director of Breaking the Silence. He was supposed to be Congresswoman Talib and Omar's tour guide in the West Bank. Thank you, sir, for joining us today. Joining me now is someone with vast experience in dealing with foreign governments, often in critical times in our nation's history, Elizabeth Holtzman. She served as a member of Congress, a member of the House Judiciary Committee. She currently serves as an attorney with Herrick Feinstein, where she focuses on government relations. And our viewers will know you from your involvement in our coverage of the Mueller report.
Of course.
But you were a member of Congress, and you were a member of Congress, as all members of Congress are, at times when we discuss our relationship with Israel, a relationship that involves a transfer of a lot of money to Israel and a very strong alliance, political alliance, and an alliance in terms of safety and security around the world. Look at this situation and tell me what you make of it.
Well, I'm kind of shocked. I'm shocked that a president of the United States would use the power of his office to try to humiliate two congresswomen, two Muslim congresswomen, two congresswomen of color, and that this endeavor to misuse the powers of his office and to humiliate his political opponents, this endeavor is being supported by the government of Israel. Israel has, for such a long time, enjoyed the support of the United States and the United States Congress. I don't
and both parties. There's an impression out there that the Democrats are anti-Israel and Republicans pro-Israel.
Of course not.
Congress is a pretty pro-Israel organization.
Absolutely. And many members of Congress, if not all of them, have been to Israel and seen it. And I think one of the important things about your prior guest was that he's an Israeli. It shows the vibrancy of the Israeli democracy. That's something that people won't necessarily know sitting in the United States. And so it seems to me surprising for Israel to be participating in any kind of display of disrespect for Congress, but I think it's also surprising that they would keep a member of Congress out. I remember when I was in Congress, we were in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. Many members of Congress went to the Soviet Union at that time. I went to the Soviet Union. Soviet Union followed us, and they knew we were going to be critical. They knew we would criticize them in the Soviet Union. And when we got back, we met people who told us about what the conditions were really like for Soviet Jews, for refuseniks. I met with some of the top refuseniks and dissidents in the Soviet Union. I came back. I criticized the Soviet Union, but
and that was actually an adversarial government. Israel and America are not adversarial.
Right, totally adversarial. But the Soviet Union didn't shut its doors to us.
Yeah.
And actually, some positive things came from those trips. I mean, one of the things that came out of it was a cooperation agreement over evidence about Nazi war criminals living in the United States, which would never have been possible if we'd not gone there to start doing it. So important things can come out of congressional meetings with people in other countries. One, you can voice your displeasure to the government officials. Two, you can actually learn much more about how these countries are working, both for the good and for the bad, if that's the case. And why would you stop it?
And your mind would broaden from that thing. So if people who are critical, if people think that Rasheda Talib and Ilhan Omar don't have a correct view of what's going on in Israel, they were going to go there.
Right, and they learned something, and they might learn something very positive that would surprise them, and that's also good. And they might learn negative things, but it's really important for Israel and for the United States for people to see Congress, American tax dollars go there, billions of dollars go there every year. Congress is entitled to understand what's happening with its money, but our allies should show respect to members of Congress.
Liz, always good to talk to you. Thank you for joining me. Elizabeth Holtzman is a counsel with Herrick Feinstein and a former U.S. Congresswoman.